Good afternoon, and thank you for joining today's webinar. My name is Jennifer Cooley, and I am the Education and Outreach Manager for the State Historical Museum. I am excited for our webinar today, and I hope you've been able to watch the Carrie Chapman Catt Warrior for Women documentary on Iowa PBS's website. The webinar today is part of the State Historical Society of Iowa's 19th Amendment Centennial Celebration. American women started voting nationwide after the 19th Amendment went into effect on August 26, 1920. 100 years later, the State Historical Society of Iowa commemorates that milestone and the Iowans who marched toward it with a series of monthly programs and events through August. Please also join us for the Iowa History 101 webinar series that takes place on the 2nd and 4th Tuesdays through August. A few housekeeping points before I introduce our speakers. Everyone came into this webinar on mute with cameras off. The webinar is being recorded and will be placed on the Iowa Culture page of YouTube in a few days. I have disabled the chat function, but if you have a question, please type them into the Q&A feature. My colleague Matt Beyer is watching that feature and will prepare a list of questions for the speakers at the end of the presentation. But please note, we may not be able to get to all of the questions. Now I'm happy to introduce our two speakers. Tim Lane, who will speak first, is the great-great-nephew of Carrie Lane Chapman Catt. Tim's great-grandfather was Carrie's older brother, Charles. Tim is also a certified Iowa history buff. He has written hundreds of historical items and won an award for his Iowa Heritage piece on Claire Patterson. Tim graduated from UNI with a degree in history, but an invitation to be an epidemiologist in Korea with the Peace Corps led to a 30-year career at the Iowa Department of Public Health. Tim is the co-chair of the Iowa World War I Centennial Committee and has in the last several years been part of various initiatives to establish memorials to women. Laurel Bower, who will speak second, grew up on a farm near Creston and graduated with a bachelor's degree in broadcast news from Drake University. Laurel has produced, written, and edited historical documentaries and a variety of other programs for Iowa PBS for the past 25 years. Some of her other documentaries include The Farm Crisis, The People and Pictures, Stories from the Weddick Farm Photos, and More Than a Game, 6-on-6 basketball in Iowa. And now I'm happy to turn it over to Tim to begin the webinar.
Greetings. At my last public presentation on Carrie, Jane Cox was present. That's like doing a talk on biblical floods with Noah in the audience. To all Catt scholars that may be listening, I vow to do her justice. But I first wish to start with a quick 3-question pre-test. Who was Peter Francisco? How many Americans voted in our first presidential election? And how many women voted in the election of 1920? Okay, test over, put your pencils down. Peter became an American hero after being abandoned here as a young boy in the 1700s. He was left on a pier by pirates and spoke a tongue that turned out to be Portuguese, but he thrived. By thrive, I mean he grew to 6'8" and 260 pounds. When he joined the Continental Army, his exploits surpassed his dimensions. Time and again during the Revolution, he single-handedly turned the tide of battle. He became known as the Giant of the Revolution. For the greater part of the last century, before the creation of the Catt Center, the 19th Amendment Society, the publication of the Women's Hour, and now the development of Warrior for Women and other efforts, the chief, or giant of the suffrage movement, my great-aunt Carrie, had about the same public profile as this warrior for men. Even on the 100th anniversary of the League of Women Voters, the Iowa State Daily was critical of the 19th Amendment for not enfranchising African Americans, when it in fact enfranchised more African Americans than any other action and doubled the total number of African American voters. The answer to the second question was about our first election was 69. So Peter and his superhuman efforts allowed 69 white privileged men to vote in our first presidential election. The theme of the revolution was all men are created equal, but only a few got the vote. The revolution, like the 19th Amendment, was hard won, but not done. This comparison with the giant of the revolution and the father of the country is because I believe that Carrie is their equal, if not superior. Under Carrie's leadership, an army of women and men campaigned and established the 19th Amendment that in turn allowed between 8 and 10 million women to vote in the election of 1920, while enfranchising approximately 35 million. 35 million peacefully enfranchised versus 69 after the American Revolution. The Herculean effort of Carrie was not the only factor, but was still huge. No other action, be it by force or political procedure, provided more Americans the leverage of enfranchise than the 19th Amendment, and no other action, be it by force or political procedure, enfranchised more African Americans than the 19th Amendment, and no action was achieved with such enormous odds against it. Remember, men, for the most part, had to vote to concede power and allow women, including women of color, to vote, and rarely was there a simple majority that had to be achieved. Imagine playing 1,000 games where all ties went to the opponent. You had to win by scoring twice as many points, and in many cases, the officials were against you, even in Iowa. Suffrage campaigners not only had to muster more voters than their opponents, but also phantoms. Voter turnout often surpassed voter registration in certain districts. Even when they won, they lost. And perhaps Carrie was at her best in those times of depression and even possible resignation. Let me point out that on some occasions, George Washington lost, but each battle wore down British support for the war at home. He thus would win even when losing. I tend to recall the description of Ginger Rogers having to do everything Fred Astaire did, only backwards and in heels. It was an amazing accomplishment done with great prowess. Kudos to PBS for this documentary and the exceptional job describing Carrie's abilities in various interviews. But let me provide additional background. In October of 1918, NASA, the National American Women's Suffrage Association, lost a battle in the Senate by 1 vote. That month was the deadliest month in American history. While an Allied victory was imminent in Europe, death stalked America. It was not uncommon for physicians that served in Europe to say the conditions at home were worse. We compared COVID-19 to the Spanish flu. They compared Spanish flu to the Black Death. Camp Dodge recorded over 50 deaths a day in October of 1918. Our life expectancy in America fell 12 years. And as returning African American servicemen pushed for equality, they were met with hate, leading to race riots that saturated the summer of 1919 with blood, and thus was known as the Red Summer. The greatest pandemic we ever saw, a world war, and riots all had to be dealt with on the already difficult road to victory. This was not an uphill battle, but an up-cliff struggle, and one with an overhang. In his campaigns, Washington had 17 battles and won 6. 4 were considered ties. So his record of 6, 7, and 4 was impressive, as Carrie at times would go 0 for 50. But again, therein lies her resilience and strength. One of the most accurate parts of the documentary came after the magnificent campaign and loss in New York. Time and again, Carrie stated that if we learn from this, there is no defeat, only delayed victory. To her troops, the message was also always, we start tomorrow on the next effort, or as in New York, the same effort. But I've gotten decades ahead of myself. My favorite portraits and stories of my Aunt Carrie are from her younger years. Perhaps by now you have heard them, but they are worth repeating. And it is my thought that every young girl, young boy, and in fact every Iowan would benefit from the lessons Carrie provided for us at the ages 6, 8, 13, 19, as well as 41 and 60. When she was 6 and witnessed boys taunting a girl after her hoop fell out of her skirt, Carrie lectured one bully that such behavior was not acceptable and slapped the offender. In her defense, corporal punishment was much more common in the 1860s. When boys chased girls with snakes, Carrie studied their protocols and did the same to them with the same desired results. In 1872, when she found out that women could not vote and any man could, she called her shot, asserting, someday I will do something to change that. By the way, the current photo is one of my favorite as Carrie is wearing her biking gloves. In college, she demanded that women be allowed to debate in the Crescent Society, the college literary club. The next year, the society put her in charge of that competition. She did not just change the culture, she took it over. At that time, land-grant colleges were administered by military officers, and the male students were required to do drill, but strove to avoid it. When the president of the college lectured on the universal value of exercise for the mind and body, Carrie had one question. Then why isn't there an option for co-eds? Thus, Company G for Girls, perhaps the first physical education program for college women in America, was founded. She was a force of nature, but also universally admired. In honor of Company G, I have two suggested reads from this short lecture. The first is Hello Girls by Elizabeth Cobb, and the second, Radium Girls by Kate Moore. Both are germane. I repeat, Carrie was a natural, a phenomenon, a born leader. I'm constantly amazed by ESPN. There is no stat they don't collect and no action they don't create stats for. Yards after catch, yak, launch speed, catch probability, completions versus interceptions, return yards of punts by hang time ad infinitum. Too bad the Women's Journal of Suffrage and News didn't have a fantasy suffrage page with the same type of numbers. Perhaps the entire suffrage program news or ESPN. I think Carrie would not only lead the league, but lead all leagues. Many proclaimed her to be the best speaker in the United States. I think there were stats to back that up. MMTs, for example, most miles traveled, Carrie. NSG, number of speeches given, Carrie. And launch speed, which was mercurial. Carrie joined the Crescent Society and within a year was in charge. She goes from teacher to principal to superintendent in less than 2 years. In her first canvass for suffrage in Mason City, state officials take note of the record numbers. At her first state convention, she is recognized regionally. At her first regional conference, she was noticed nationally. At her first national meeting, again noticed. Soon she was considered the heir apparent to Susan B. Anthony and noticed internationally. Like Peter Francisco, Carrie stood out. Colorado in 1893 was her first major effort and victory. The vote was 35,798 to 29,461, a winning margin of 6,237 votes. Carrie gave 100 speeches in 29 counties. 26 of those supported the question, and thus a star was added to the suffrage win column. Raymond Robbins recalled a speech Carrie gave from that era. Clear in every detail, you spoke for women's suffrage against an almost unbroken wall of opposition. Your intelligence, eloquence, and charm broke down those walls of opposition, and you finished with your audience of hardened politicians standing in wild applause, just for your glorious courage and intellectual power of your achievement. He went on, always will you remain for me the incarnation of daring intelligence and beauty. I think Raymond may have had something for my aunt. Be it in San Francisco or Rocky Ford, Colorado, or Rome, she carved her message into the core of her audience. On September 7th of 1893, the Rocky Ford Enterprise reported Mrs. Chapman is very able, eloquent, and magnetic, and made a splendid plea for simple justice to one half of the citizens of the state. Mrs. Philip Snowden of Great Britain, known as a brilliant speaker, was asked who was the best leader of suffrage movement. She was emphatic. I will go no further, measured by the grasp and power of her mind and her wisdom, her self-control, and her consecration to a great cause, by her power to plan, her capacity to execute, and her genius for leadership, by her unsurpassed eloquence and speech, and her absolute unselfish devotion to the cause of women. I hold Carrie Chapman Catt, the first and greatest woman of the English-speaking race. In her work, Van Voren noted her presence and magnetism, commanding full attention. She noticed the voice that could resonate through a hall prior to microphones and her rousing calls for action. When Carrie spoke, her audience listened. In sports, there are great coaches that produce generations of new coaches or coaching trees. Carrie developed a forest. There are luminaries like Eleanor Roosevelt, who was not a suffragist prior to her friendship with Carrie, and Catherine McCormick, who went on to blaze an amazing, interesting trail of her own. But there were thousands more individuals as well in resulting actions, dominoes, if you will. Take Elizabeth Inslee. As a result of the 1893 Colorado win, one of her most stunning and significant victories, there were other victories that followed. That vote enfranchised Elizabeth and her colleagues in the Colored Women's Republican Club and the Women's League of Denver. These women were in turn successful in electing an African-American, Joseph Henry Stewart, to the Colorado Assembly, along with 3 women. That 1894 election led to some groundbreaking civil rights legislation. In that one action, there were dominoes for women, African Americans, and civil rights legislation in Colorado, and through their example, other states. Her tenacity and skill, combined with her lofty vision, was also facilitated by her attention to details, and by that I mean all details. When cartoons like the one I hope is on the screen now ran in newspapers, Carrie made it clear that no members of NASA should be seen with an umbrella. A history geek might spiral off on how Chamberlain and his umbrella had a similar impact on diplomats after his Munich Compromise, or how Hong Kong protesters adopted rather than abandoned the umbrella in their umbrella revolution. Luckily, I am not that guy. Another detail in her playbook included an effort to avoid churches as venues because it was easier to get men to theaters or union halls. Yet she had a Sunday speech that invoked scriptures and divine guidance. She spoke from the back of a wagon, in a barn, farm homes, at universities, chautauquas, fairs, union meetings, as well as to members of Parliament, Congress, the President, kings, and nations. But of all the talking she did, perhaps it is possible to determine the most important 20 minutes. And the audience didn't consist of thousands, but one. I'm referring to the time spent with Miriam Leslie. Up until her death, Miriam had donated $300 to the cause and had only spent one occasion 20 minutes alone with Carrie. So when it was announced, then litigated, and then settled in court, resulting in the delivery of a suitcase of silver, gold, gems, jewelry, and other financial resources to Carrie as part of the $1 million settlement, it is worth noting both Carrie's persuasive impact and her ethical approach to management. Carrie immediately compiled a commission of trusted and respected individuals to help allocate the fortune, including efforts to teach women how to vote. As a student at Iowa Agricultural College, Carrie earned 9 cents an hour. So from earning 3 cents for 20 minutes work in college to 100,000 or 50,000 after litigation per minute when speaking to Leslie is one amazing journey. Obviously, education pays. As a teacher, Carrie would earn 6 cents over that same period, or 8 cents as a superintendent. The windfall represented 100 years of income working in the schools of Iowa. That 7 decimal point advance from a salary measured in pennies to access to $1 million was reflected in her lifestyle. To save money in the 1890s, she would stay at the house of supporters and on occasion have to share a bed with Aunt Susan, who she was glad to report was quite thin. I am intrigued to discover today that at the St. Francis in San Francisco, the Brown Palace in Denver, and the Hermitage Hotel in Nashville, one can determine and book the actual room accommodations she enjoyed as her budget allowed. Later, while in Washington, D.C. on business, she would stay at her own room in the Suffrage House, or on occasion, the White House. Carrie's story would qualify as a Horatio Alger novel, except there were, of course, never any of those about girls. It is also important to note that Alice Paul brought value to the effort. Her militancy, combined with Carrie's centrist approach, complemented each other. But these funds multiplied the impact of NASA. While Alice was cutting out coupons, Carrie was cutting checks. I also wish to address the term militant. Alice was in your face and demonstrative, but her message and Carrie's was one and the same, delivered in different tones and methods, and today could never be considered militant. Neither could Carrie, though some considered her a hawk. Prior to World War I, Carrie, like President Wilson, was dead set against war. But as America entered the fight, opposition to it would have burdened the campaign with the taint of being anti-American and make the trek to ratification even more difficult. Opposing the war would not end the conflict, while support would help suffrage. On the very first debates Carrie had with a young man in her neighborhood, it focused on his argument that men voted because they served in war. She retorted that many men didn't serve, yet still voted. In 1917, she put another stake in the heart of this long-standing anti-suffrage argument. The compromise was with war, not suffrage. From her 13th year, there was no compromise. And when she talked about universal suffrage, it was a universe including the women of China, Hawaii, South Africa, Hong Kong, the Philippines. Carrie would get off a train in South Africa or China and at 10 a.m. and by dinner have formed 3 women's clubs. I'm confident if she would have ever met someone from outer space, her first question would have been on voting rights and peace. She would surely assume that such advanced travelers would have achieved the advanced state she felt was inevitable for humans. despite all the evidence to the contrary. I wish to stress the fact that the 19th was not just monumental achievement, it was miraculous. For his effort, Washington got a state, rivers, countries, currency, schools, and of course, Mount Rushmore. Carrie got an American stamp and also one in Turkey, a statue in Tennessee, a building on ISU's campus, a mention in Wonder Woman comics that we saw earlier in the presentation, and my current favorite, a bike jersey. It was not on par with George, but she was doing a bit better than Peter. Their grave sites highlight the discrepancy between his story and her story. This is no knock on George. He is deserving of all the credit that he deserves. I just find the contrast interesting. And now I will pass the virtual baton to Laurel.
Thank you, Tim. That was wonderful. As mentioned, I'm a producer at Iowa PBS, and I recently produced Carrie Chapman Catt, Warrior for Women. I'd like to just talk a little bit about that journey. I began this documentary about 2 years ago when a colleague of mine suggested that Iowa PBS look into producing something about Carrie Chapman Catt for the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment. Not only was it a momentous occasion, but Carrie Chapman Catt was a woman whose story had not fully been told. Catt was one of the leading suffragists during the fight to win women the vote, yet many people didn't know her. I was ashamed to admit that I, an Iowan, hadn't heard much about Catt in my own history classes. I was intrigued to learn more about her and decided to tell her story by producing this documentary. Carrie Chapman Catt was born in Ripon, Wisconsin in 1859, and soon after her family moved to a farm outside of Charles City, Iowa, where she would spend her formative years. I felt obligated as an Iowan to tell her story. Catt would become one of the most important leaders in the women's suffrage movement with her winning plan, a two-pronged approach to winning women the vote. It carefully coordinated state suffrage campaigns with a drive for a constitutional amendment. I began producing the Carrie Chapman Catt documentary, much like I do all the documentaries I work on, with research, lots and lots of research. I traveled to Charles City, Iowa State University, a variety of libraries and historical societies, visited multiple websites, including extensive research of her papers at the Library of Congress and National Archives, and read several books about her. And I would like to note that anyone can currently go to the Library of Congress website. Everything for the 19th Amendment and women's suffrage is currently online. It's really interesting. I wanted to tell Catt's personal story growing up in Charles City. And that was how I began developing the documentary. I wanted to talk about her growing up in Charles City, attending Iowa State University, and being one of the first female superintendents in the country. I wanted to focus on her work for women's equality, something that started when she was just 13 years old and witnessed her mother not being able to vote in the 1872 election. She was mortified to learn that women couldn't vote, and at that very moment made it her life's ambition to change that. I also wanted to show how Catt won women the vote. She devoted over 40 years of her life fighting for the passage of the 19th Amendment. And while talking about her strategy, I wanted viewers to understand how she was able to influence the ratification of key states leading to the federal amendment. I also wanted viewers to understand what it took to achieve this and to explain what was going on not only within the women's suffrage movement, but set the stage for what the nation and world was like during this time, especially what it was like for women. To support my research, I began calling women that I hope to interview for the documentary. Women who were in academia, authors, historians, etc. Women who could not only talk about Carrie, but also about the women's suffrage movement in general. And in this picture, you'll see Elaine Weiss, who was author of The Women's Hour, a really interesting book, and she's been on PBS in several different places talking about Carrie Chapman Catt. This began the journey that, along with my videographer Cameron McCoy, took us places across the nation, to interview these women and to shoot video of places and things that would help illustrate Catt's life, her work, and the women's suffrage movement. We visited Catt's Girlhood home in Charles City, which I would highly recommend visiting. She grew up on the farm and graduated high school in Charles City. The city has really worked hard to honor her memory. Today, people can visit the Carrie Lane Chapman Catt Girlhood home and museum, or they can take a tour of her girlhood home, take a walk through the Heritage Apple Orchard and Native Prairie, and learn more about Catt's life in the Interpretive Center. One of my favorite places, we visited Nashville, Tennessee, where Catt spent several weeks working with local suffragists to pass legislation that would ensure a federal amendment. Originally, she had only planned on being there a few days, but Tennessee was a hotbed of activity, with both suffragists and anti-suffragists voicing their stances on suffrage for women. In the end, and largely because of Catt's work, Tennessee became the 36th state to ratify the 19th Amendment to the Constitution. We traveled to upstate New York to the town of Seneca Falls, where the first convention for women's rights was held in 1848. A group of women, including Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, and a few men gathered in Seneca Falls to talk about women's rights. They wrote the Declaration of Sentiments, which called for women's equality and suffrage. It was very moving for me to be in the exact spot where this all took place. Prior to our trip to Seneca Falls, we visited Washington, D.C. and the nation's capital to videotape the statue of the foremothers of the women's suffrage movement, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott, and Susan B. Anthony. Washington, D.C. bear witness to many suffrage activities with parades, protests, etc., organized by the likes of Carrie Chapman Catt and Alice Paul, who Tim mentioned earlier. Carrie Chapman Catt spent her entire adult life fighting for women's suffrage. It was a humbling experience to drive to her gravesite in the Bronx, New York City. She is buried alongside her dear friend, Mary Garrett Hay, whom she fought for women's equality with for nearly 40 years. Their headstone reads, "Here lie two united in friendship for 38 years through constant service to a great cause." After traveling over 6,000 miles and conducting 19 interviews, I delved into the writing and editing phases of the production. I like to edit the rough cut of all of my documentaries to piece together the story, and then at the end I bring in an editor to polish the look and sound of the program. The editing process takes several weeks to get the story exactly how we want it. As I edited, I decided on a person who I wanted to narrate the documentary. I chose Kate Mulgrew. Some of you may have heard of her. She grew up in Dubuque, Iowa, and has been a successful actress for decades. You may recognize her name as Captain Catherine Janeway on Star Trek, Voyager, and Galena, or more recently as Red on Orange is the New Black. She really was thrilled with the script and was drawn to the topic. The Iowa PBS documentary, Carrie Chapman Catt, Warrior for Women, premiered on statewide Iowa PBS on May 5th. The program is being distributed to other PBS stations nationwide. We had several screenings planned for the documentary, but with COVID-19, we were unable to hold all of them. We were lucky enough to hold a few. And I really appreciate the State Historical Society of Iowa allowing us to do this and get the word out there. I worked really hard for 2 years on this project, and in all of the documentaries I've produced over the 25 years, this one is one of my favorites. The women's suffrage movement is an important part of our history that doesn't get the attention it deserves. Winning women the vote was a long, hard-fought battle. Carrie Chapman Catt was one of the fearless leaders who made the 19th Amendment happen. She and the many other women who were part of the women's suffrage movement should be remembered and celebrated. I'll close with one of my favorite quotes by her. "We women demand an equal voice. We shall accept nothing less." Thank you.
Thank you, Tim and Laurel. we have some time to answer some questions. However, before I pose the first question, I want to remind our participants that you can submit your questions through the Q&A feature here on your screen. So please feel free to do that. We are on a schedule, so please note we may not be able to get to all the questions before the end of the webinar. And this is the question for Laurel first, from Leo Landis. What story did you have to leave out of the documentary that you wished you could have included?
Oh, that's hard. There were so many stories that I would love to have included because it's such an amazing part of our history. I think I would like to have talked more about her life after the 19th Amendment was passed, but within an hour really had to focus on her work for women's right to vote. So just because she was such an exceptional person and woman, she went on to work for world peace for most of the rest of her life. I would like to have been able to expand on that, but really the focus was her work and the celebration of the 19th Amendment. So I would say that was probably, if I had more time or a few more parts, I would have gone into that more.
And continuing in that vein of finding out things about her life and things that are interesting, this is the question for both Tim and Laurel, and we'll start with Tim first. What's the most surprising thing you found in your research?
There's, it's especially over the last couple of years as items have become digitalized and more and more and more kind of speeches and other aspects of Carrie's life become open. It's just a wealth of information, and it's just a lot of little things that kind of you already knew the core of Carrie's personality and character, but you'd find aspects of it. Let me mention just now during the season when there's so many graduation speeches being given virtually, I was reviewing Carrie's graduation speeches and noticed that NPR had chosen one of hers as one of the best all-time graduation speeches. So little things like that, like I had indicated, I know she is a great speaker, but reading some of the graduation presentations she did, especially in this period of graduations, was gratifying. And then just a lot of little things, like in 1872, when she became a suffragist, in that election, that was the same election that Susan B. Anthony was getting arrested. So they were kind of, even when she was 13-year-olds, walking in lockstep.
Yes. Yeah, and I would say, like Tim, it's such an extraordinary story, not only women's suffrage movement in general, but Carrie's story. And I think there were so many little things here and there, and of all the books that I've read about her and the research I've done, like I said earlier, I would love to have brought up in the documentary. I think one of them that I was most astonished by, I read that where she had migraines and heart problems, and it's just extraordinary to me that she was able to travel the world and to have the stamina and the determination to fight for women. And other things that I think I found most interesting were how a lot of the things that she fought for, while things are much better today, we're still fighting for in regards to women's equality and voting rights. And I think that's why, not only to celebrate the 19th Amendment, but it's such a timely subject for all of us to think about and to continue to think about.
And to continue that point of the current situation, a question for both Tim and Laurel. How do you think Carrie Chapman Catt would interpret the current social and political demonstrations? For example, the Me2 movement. And Tim, if you want to go first.
I will go first, and I'll address the Me Too. And she had her own Me Too, experience in San Francisco, as she arrived, and her first husband, George Chapman, had already passed away. But let me start with an editorial cartoon in this last Monday's paper that had 3 servicemen saluting, and the caption was, "Greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends." So it mentions 2 times man. After decades of women serving in the military, they still don't get represented. So, right there should be dropping a letter off with their secretary to the various different papers to rail against that. And although she would probably still be focused on peace, she would probably also find time to be supportive of women and their statements, and making sure that they were heard and that justice was played out in these instances.
Yeah, I would agree with Tim. It's something we talk about kind of towards the end of the documentary, is where we are today. And some of the women that we interviewed talked about what they thought Carrie or some of the other women suffragists would think. And at first I thought, I think Carrie would be really surprised that we still don't have equality, or that we still don't have a woman president. But then I got to thinking that, they fought for 72 years to get the 19th Amendment passed, decades and decades, and so many disappointments along the way. So I'm not sure she would be surprised. I think they would be very disappointed. But I think if there's anything we can learn from her and so many of the others, is that we keep fighting, we keep working towards that goal. And I think younger generations especially could really learn from her and from the other people who fought, because there were men too, it's not just women, but people who fought for this. And that I don't know. We're still looking at the equal rights situation too, and it's even been a longer battle. So I think she would be on the front lines fighting once again.
And along with that too, it brings up the conversation of the struggle and how long the struggle for suffrage took. And a question for Tim would be, when you were researching suffrage history, did it become apparent why it took so long for women to actually gain suffrage?
Well, I'll start back with my up cliff, kind of observation. When Colorado was her first victory, but her kind of first field operation was in South Dakota, other than, of course, Mason City or Seattle, where she was living it for brief periods of time. They had pennies, and they were campaigning against a liquor industry that was willing to spend $500,000. So that whole issue of her, becoming a lot better off when through her second marriage especially, and through the financing. She also directed the National Association. We have to start collecting money and creating a war chest, because they were facing a lot of opposition that was well funded, as well as a lot of deeply ingrained biases. Well, that this is going to ruin, just really, really bizarre, inane arguments to the contrary, that women physically didn't have the capability of voting, as if it was some sort of, strenuous activity, or this would ruin the household, once every 4 years or 2 years or even every year, to walk down to the general store or the school and cast a ballot was some sort of, thing that was going to disrupt the household and the whole balance of nature. It was just utterly absurd, but yet, people had to fight for it. And oftentimes they just had to rely on luck. Carrie in Colorado became a great speaker on silver versus gold, and this happened during the Panic of 1893, and caught a break. But every time they would capture a state, they would have more luck or more information and a game plan for the next. Like I said, she was constantly compiling information and notes to help her in the next campaign. And again, had the most amazing spirit that was able to persevere through all those losses. So again, great character, great endurance, and a great political mind.
It is interesting how long it took, and I think all those things add up to why it took so many decades and years. So the next question is for Laurel, and it's more about the documentary, which is fantastic. How do you decide what stories will make good documentaries when there are so many fantastic stories to tell?
It is hard because you work on something for 2 years, and there are so many more stories I would love to tell. But I think, as I mentioned for this documentary, not only were we approaching the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, Carrie Chapman Catt was always kind of in the back of my mind through the years as someone who was an interesting character to talk about and to tell her story. And so when someone in our education department said, this would be the perfect timing, I grabbed a hold of it and ran with it. And I do think that her story, as well as many other women suffragists, and there were many, white suffragists, African American suffragists. I mean, there are so many interesting stories in that once you started researching about her and talking to people about her, historians or people like Tim, it was really quite easy to tell her story. I just really felt like I wanted to put it in context with, as you just asked Tim, why was it such a battle and what was going on, not only in the world, but nationally for women especially, and how they had little to no power. And so how was this able to be achieved? So I'm not sure if I answered that right, but I just felt like her story was so important for so many reasons. And as an Iowan, as Iowa PBS, it was important for us to tell her story. But not only did it affect Iowa, but the nation. And there were so many elements of it that were interesting to me, as we've mentioned, not only because of the history, but because of what it really represents today too.
I think we all can be proud of the story that you shared, especially as Iowans, particularly that, someone great came from our state and have a great story now about them to watch. So I'm happy to hear that and see it out there. And I hope everyone can, if you haven't watched yet, please watch it. The next question is for Tim from John Olson. Could you speak to the creation of the League of Women's Voter by Catt and the frustration suffragists felt when relatively few women voted after achieving the vote?
Certainly, I will do so, but I also want to back up in saying, that the length of time devoted to this, Michael Jordan got, 10 hours for one season. This could have easily been a 10-hour presentation. And I skirted over the state of Colorado and talked about her presentations in Rocky Ford, but she presented in Buena Vista, Telluride, Aspen, towns that I don't think even exist anymore. And when you think of 100, and back then in 93, traveling from, like Telluride to Durango, it's just, wow. It's even more amazing, especially the story of her on the push car, riding from one town to another faster than a car can travel there, today is to me, just given I'm talking about Colorado, like a really great vein of ore to mine. Now, there's two things I want to mention about the League of Women Voters. If you read the Williamton Lie, you know that she, as she traveled through the South, as she saw what had happened to Black men after they had received the vote, she knew that this was not the end, that there was going to be battles ahead. So I think one of the greatest tributes to her foresight and her knowledge that getting the people enfranchised was, step one, but step two was, educating them, and then making sure there was an organization, an army out there to help fight that was crucial, and thus that. And I think it's also valuable to note that part of the 19th Amendment stipulated that Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. I mean, they were laying the groundwork in 1920, for the 1960s and voter right bills through this work. Again, she saw that there was going to be problems ahead, and she addressed it. And so she saw the League of Women Voters as a crucial number two punch after the number one punch of the 19th Amendment. Now, I have to beg your forgiveness. I remember that there was a second part to that question after the League. Can you remind me of that?
It was in regards to women not turning out to vote after the passage of suffrage.
Remember that if you were to watch It's a Wonderful Life, and when Mr. Gower gets a telegram, it's from that very same era telling him that his son had died. We were still in that pandemic. Women were kind of maybe not surprised, but oh gosh, what am I going to do, and where am I going to go, and should I get a child care? She was probably thinking more would have. But I'll accept the liberal estimate of the 10 million. It was, and as I pointed out, significantly better than the men did in their first presidential election. Of course, they could only have 69 or 72 men vote. But I think she understood that number would grow. She also understood that there was a strong anti-suffrage association that consisted of women. So this wasn't going to be the end all, but she realized at the same time that, well, if it is only 8 to 10 million, that 8 to 10 million can start, swaying things. And in fact, even before those 8 to 10 million women voted, issues like maternal and child health all of a sudden became issues that men were willing to consider. So even before the vote happened, change was afoot.
We've had some wonderful questions so far, and thank you, Tim, for that response. However, this will be our last two questions before wrapping up today's webinar. Time is moving fast for us today, which is always great. We're learning a lot. So Laurel, the last question for you today, pretty simple, but what was your favorite part of creating this fantastic documentary?
I think the traveling to different places where Carrie was, and also interviewing all of the women that are in the documentary. They're so insightful, so bright, but it was, like I mentioned, it was so humbling to be in Seneca Falls where these women gathered for the first time. I mean, there were other parts earlier in history where women were gathering, but this is kind of one of the biggest, most prominent gatherings where people really took note. And to be in that place where they were, it was pretty incredible. And other travels, we, as I mentioned, went to the cemetery in the Bronx, and that was a really moving moment for me, just to be there and to see her headstone and the wonderful quote that's on it. And it just and I think one little side note is that she's buried on Laurel Avenue in the cemetery, which I thought was really like, wow, it was meant to be. Yeah, so I think it's just traveling and talking to all of these women that we met, and learning more about this woman who I am really proud to have helped tell her story. So I think that was the favorite part for me, was really learning about her and hearing from other people.
That sounds wonderful. It would have been a great experience. And so Tim, your last question for today is there any unknown or lesser known fact about Carrie Lane Chapman Catt that you wish was more well known to people?
Probably multiple things that, that she achieved that I would like known. For example, as I'd indicated, African Americans went off to World War I thinking that they were going to enhance their position, fighting for democracy, and then returning home and getting democracy. But as soon as they started to return, there was virulent response to that, increased in Jim Crow, increased in lynchings, increased in just, oh, well, we're going to, release Birth of a Nation and build a stone mountain and do these other things to make sure, and again, it's always, confusing to me how 38 states, many of them in the North, had monuments to the Confederacy. But there was an issue that a lot of African troops or African American troops were used as occupation troops at the end of World War I. And as soon as that happened, the South started creating these vignettes that, well, they're raping German women and they're stealing things. And Carrie happened to be in Europe at the time and helped Mary Church Terrell, who was being asked to sign a petition to have those troops removed. And Carrie came to their defense. She said, I've investigated, I've talked with folks, I've found out that not only are they not doing those things, that women in Germany find them much more easy to get along with than white troops. So, and again, every time there's something at the core, there's like 10 things outside of it that tell a story that I think is of immense value. And that's kind of a story that, along with her pushcart ride down the mountain in Colorado and the snake story at her home in Charles City, that's another one of my favorite ones. But again, given the finite amount of time we had here today, that was one that was just on my shelf.
I think I can agree with what you said earlier, where we could do hours upon hours about stories about Carrie. So I'm happy we had some time today to talk about her great achievements and what she has done. And with that, thank you all. Thank you, Laurel and Tim. With that answer, that is all the time we have for today's webinar. Thank you again to our two great guest speakers for leading our lecture this afternoon. I know I can say it's been a very informative lunch, and I have learned a lot. Also, thank you to everyone joining us today for the first lecture of the State Historical Museum of Iowa's Centennial Celebration of Suffrage. We hope you can join us in the upcoming weeks and over the summer for future programs hosted by the museum. The next webinar in this series will be on June 11th, and it will continue on the second and fourth Thursdays through August. There are many great stories from Iowa's past to tell in the upcoming months. For more information and to register for future webinars in this series, check out our website at iowaculture.gov/history. While you are there, you can look into some of our other fantastic digital programs, such as the weekly Goldie at Home activities for young historians, or watch video recordings of the Iowa Stories series, which is hosted by our Iowa City branch. Thank you all again for joining us today, and have a great afternoon. We look forward to virtually seeing everyone at the next webinar right here on Zoom on June 11th. Thank you again.